Hello, I am Dr. Matt Melia of Kingston University and editor of the book The Films of Ken Russell, and I am here at the National Film and Television School at the invitation of the Delius Society to interview Roger Crittenden, editor of several of Ken Russell's BBC films made for Monitor and Omnibus. Roger has a long history here at the National Film and Television School, one of its original members. But what we're going to be talking about today is his work as an editor for the BBC's art showcase in the 1960s. In particular, we're going to be talking about Delius, Song of Summer, Ken's 1968 film. So if you come with me now, we'll go and meet Roger in the cinema. Welcome, Roger. Thank you for coming to discuss Ken Russell's 1968 Monitor film, Delius, Song of Summer, for which you were the editor. You had a long history with Ken, really, or during that period. You previously worked on Isadora, is that correct, in 1966, and Dante's Inferno, 1967. Then he later went on to work on Kenneth Clarke's Civilization as editor, as he did with Ken's films. Yeah, it's worth noting as well for maybe for those who are unfamiliar with Ken's work, that he made these kind of big films for the BBC, Elgar, Dante's Inferno, the Debussy film, Delius, Isadora, but he actually made over 50 films for the BBC, many short films. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how you came into contact with Ken, really, first of all.
My first contact was as a trainee in the cutting rooms, and I happened to be attached to Monitor. He was about to make Bartok.
Okay.
And I was sitting quietly at the back of the cutting room one day watching Alan Tyrer, the editor on Monitor, who was perhaps the greatest editor I've ever met. And suddenly this guy springs into the cutting room holding a can of film. I immediately knew who it was, Mr. Russell. And he interrupted Alan and said, "Alan, I need to get some clips out of this film. Can someone come to the theatre with me and let me run it and choose what I need?" And Alan, who was rather busy with something else, just turned to me and said, "Roger, go down to the theatre and help Ken with this, will you, while I get on here?" So I walked with Ken to the viewing theatre, gave the can of film to the projectionist, went in and sat next to Ken, and he said, "I'll tell you what I want as it goes through the projector." Fine, I thought, I've got no pen, no paper, I'm in the dark, and Ken's going to shout out what bits he wants copied, which he did. "I'll have that. Yeah, to there. Right, next bit, yeah, have that." And 40 minutes later, I emerged from the cinema thinking, I'm not going to remember which bits to order. Ken immediately disappeared. And the projectionist said, "Don't worry, Rog, we're used to this." We put a bit of paper in the projector as it came out the bottom spool for you to just mark up what to get. So it was a very useful introduction to knowing what it would be like to work with Ken. Yeah. And fortunately, we got the right bits copied, so I didn't disappoint on that occasion.
Yeah, well, it's very Russell-esque, that. I mean, later on, he was very famous for his scripts really just being a foundation for what he saw in his mind's eye.
Yes.
And then what you see on the screen is really kind of what just comes out of his head at the time. He was very much one for kind of improvising ideas.
Indeed.
So, but had you been aware of Russell before your sort of introduction on Bartok?
I'd seen Elgar, which obviously was the film that really made his name in terms of the audience, the television audience, the success of that, and that was, I think, just before I joined the BBC. And so from then on, I followed his work. But I think it's worth putting him in context, because the 60s at the BBC was an era that has never been repeated in the sense that a second channel was going to be opened in the middle of that decade. Colour was coming, and so on and so forth. And there was space and room for ideas, for going beyond the normal genres that then existed. Ken became part of that. But it's worth saying that there were a dozen people who had that kind of intelligence, talent, sensibility, which Ken himself acknowledged, that the environment there in music and arts was ideal for someone of his kind, even though he pushed the envelope more than anybody else did. But I think everyone else was grateful for that, because it gave them almost a passport to make the kind of films they wanted to make, even though they were not necessarily as extravagant or strangely interesting as Ken's work.
Well, that period at the BBC, a whole host of kind of new, young, experimental filmmakers who would then go on to kind of form this new era of British filmmaking at the time. And I think kind of coming out of the sort of the post-war period, the BBC into the 1960s becomes a real sort of crucible of experimentation and modernisation, particularly under people like Hugh Carlton-Green, who was the Director General, and of course David Attenborough, who became the controller of BBC Two, someone really responsible for sort of shaping the way television worked.
It was a courage.
Yeah.
A courage amongst the producers at the time that was lost, sadly, but it meant they would allow talent, recognise talent, and give it its its chance.
We were talking about innovation at the BBC in that post-war period, and experimentalism, and the BBC being a kind of a crucible of change and experimentalism and modernisation. And one of the things that really strikes me is you mentioned Elgar. That's a very kind of cinematic piece of television. We have that beautiful opening on the Malvern Hills, huge sweeping opening, which is it's a filmmaker. It's a filmmaker making cinema for television at a time when TV screens were a very limited space. And today we're used to cinematic television, but Ken was doing it back in the early 1960s. He's a progenitor of this cinematic TV we have today.
Yeah, and it's worth saying that television at the time was run by engineers. And engineers had their own technical standards.
Yeah.
And they imposed those standards on filmmakers. So filmmakers were supposed to use a certain film stock, which was low contrast. Ken would never use low contrast. He wanted a cinematic feel.
Yeah.
And he was always at odds with the engineers, which is why someone, whenever a film of his was transmitted, had to go into the transmission control and make sure that the engineers didn't lower the contrast on transmission, having had a print made with proper film stock.
Yeah.
And I had to do that several times,
really?
obviously.
Yeah.
And it was so amazing because the engineers would have their finger on the dial, turning down the contrast unless you... I was there once when Ken actually slapped the wrist of an engineer and stopped him doing this. And you could see on transmission sometimes, if you were aware of this, where the engineers did this, and you would suddenly, the image would lose its focus, and become what was passable for engineers.
Yeah.
You know.
Fantastic. Yeah. We were going to talk very shortly about the 1968 film Delius, Song of Summer, and there's really interesting material in the archive about when that was first transmitted and the technical difficulties that ran into when it was first transmitted. So you'd worked with Ken on...
I'd been aware of him.
Yeah, you'd been aware
as
of
a trainee.
As a trainee. What was his reputation at the BBC like at that point?
I can talk from the point of view perhaps just of editors, but it probably applies to all the crafts. Everybody wanted to work on his films, On the other hand, everybody was a bit cheery about what it would be like in the actual experience of working with him, since Ken, we have said already how cinematic he was, but as a personality, he wasn't easy to read.
No.
Not the greatest communicator. You had to be aware. From an editor's point of view, it actually doesn't matter so much, because you are talking to the director through the material that you're putting together. So you have something out there which you can focus on, rather than simply trying to get a sense of what was required, or what, in this case, Ken Russell was after. So he was admired by film technicians, and it was his work that people wanted to be involved in. Not that he was totally unique. I mean, there were other people, a whole generation of filmmakers that came through at that time who were doing interesting work, just not with quite the flair that we would expect to find from Ken's next film.
Do you think that, I mean, we mentioned it briefly earlier, you were just saying that it was often quite difficult to read what he wanted. Do you think that comes down to the idea of him just kind of thinking on the spot and sort of things coming into his head, almost the spontaneity of that?
Well, you and I both know that his visualization was unique. Very few filmmakers, not just British filmmakers, with the kind of visual imagination that he had, and clearly partly developed way back from his still days of taking stills, but also being inspired by music. The two things are so totally interlinked. So that visualization was the thing that made him so different.
I think that's really the defining aspect of Russell's work, isn't it? That juncture of music and image. And right from the start, right from the start of Elgar, we get that in Delius as well, and we'll come on to this with the juncture of the sort of collision of music and images in Delius, particularly the natural world, is a real defining aspect of that film.
When I took over the Dante Rossetti film, I came to it without ever having seen the rushes.
Oh, okay.
On the first day that I then was with Ken again, I'd been told that the cut was finished. With Ken, the cut was never finished. So he took the opportunity of having a new person alongside him to consider changes. He asked me to find a shot. I had no idea where it had been filed, but he described the shot to me very clearly, and you know what scene it was meant for and so on. I spent a day going through the material trying to find this shot. I couldn't. At the end of that day, I came to the conclusion that this was an image that Ken had imagined and was in his head, but didn't exist.
Wow,
It's not totally unusual. I mean, I've had that experience a couple of other times, where a director has on his list of potential material a certain image which was never taken. But with Ken, he was so convinced, because he'd imagined the image on the screen, on his own internal mental screen. And that's the measure of how strongly he visualized.
There's an interesting parallel there, isn't there? So let's just talk about Delius very, very briefly for a second. That sequence in Delius where he is dictating to Fenby at the piano, and he has the images in his head. He has the music in his head, and Fenby is trying to note down to transcribe the music. It's very much like that with Ken, isn't it? The idea of trying to get the image down.
I mean, yes, there's a couple of scenes, aren't there? There's the first attempt that Fenby made to write down Delius's ideas, and all Delius was doing was saying ta-ta, 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 ta, which not even notes, let alone what key it's in, as Fenby replies. But then there's the example later where they're sitting by the river,
Yes.
and he describes what it is he's trying to translate into music of the bird flying and so on and so forth.
That's right. Yeah, he's just the seagull, and the way says this is the waves. This is the
Exactly.
The seagull, and
So there is. You're right. There's an analogy there.
Yeah, I do love that sequence where he's trying to transcribe to Femby, and Femby's getting more and more annoyed.
Yes.
Oh, I don't care for music of this sort. Oh, this is very weak.
Yeah.
There's some good comedy there, I think, in that.
Yes.
In that
A
sequence.
dark humour in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ken had a total antipathy both to 16mm and to the colour as then produced from Eastman. So he wanted to always still continue with 35mm black and white, which of course goes right back to his wonderful stills for Picture Post before he was ever a filmmaker. But they insisted with Dante that he start on 16mm colour. The context of this was the fact that the BBC in film department were moving from 35 to 16mm and to 16mm colour, which was quite honestly in the early stages of development and wasn't very fast film. Obviously with an image that much smaller, you didn't have the same kind of definition.
You were mentioning his sort of antipathy to 16mm, because I think this certainly comes up in some of the archival material around Delius, because he sort of butted heads over this. He'd wanted to film it a 70-minute film at 35mm on 35mm, but the BBC wanted a 60-minute film on 16mm. Eventually, they compromised at a 60-minute film on 35mm, and then he went and ignored it anyway and just filmed it at 70 minutes.
Yes, film the length he wanted. Absolutely.
So yeah, Delius comes at a really interesting time in Ken's career, because he's moving out of television and he's moving towards becoming a theatrical filmmaker. He'd already made one film in 1964, which was French Dressing. Yeah. That's a British seaside comedy in the vein of the French New Wave. And at the time of Delius, he's sort of writing an unmade film on Diaghilev and Nijinsky. He's looking towards making a film on Tchaikovsky, which will become The Music Lovers. How do you think this move into theatrical filmmaking affects or seeps into Delius?
I think in some ways a great deal. In some ways it had a counter effect. I mean, one of the things we can mention, of course, is the fact that he was already wanting to work with Christopher Gable. And Chris was, I mean, in some senses not ideal for Femby, because Femby was a much smaller man, a much slighter man, and Chris was over 6 feet and quite an impressive presence.
He'd been principal dancer at the Royal Ballet.
He had indeed. A wonderful dancer, and I think his dancing background made him a great actor. I remember some years later talking to Louise Brooks, and she told me at one point that she thought the greatest actors were dancers, because of the use of the body, being, an expressive vehicle. And I think Chris had that, and the way he performed in Delius, reducing himself in stature, becoming awkward. I mean, even just the sequence where he's chasing after Granger, running through the woods, he doesn't look. He looks so awkward. So but it's a skill
absolutely,
that a dancer learns. So there was that aspect, that personal aspect. But on the other hand, I think I've no way of knowing with Ken how and why he decided to make a very reserved film, a very controlled film. The truth is, as we both know, the life of Delius was very colourful indeed. And therefore, a film which was certainly matched or even exceeded the films he'd made on Debussy and Isadora and Rossetti would be the first thing one might expect.
Yeah.
A long discursive film, including all kinds of material, which Ken later, I have to say, included in his novelisation of the Delius life, which, as you know, is part of a double book of Algar and Delius.
That's right.
With
Brahms as well, I think.
Yes, with all the warts exposed, almost as if he was expunging what he couldn't do when he made the films for the BBC. But the discipline that he brought to Delius was, as you're saying, and it's difficult to put this into words, was still deeply cinematic. Images that which go beyond simply narrative, simply telling a plot, and being very, very expressive in ways that so much of cinema, so much of streaming these days just doesn't have. And that's the marvel, that the kind of reservation that he held in making this film was still deeply cinematic, and that the black and white actually enhances that.
When you were in the editing suite and you were sort of putting the film together and sort of making sense of it and creating it, was there a sense there that you had to adjust what you were doing accordingly? Did you think, well, this isn't a kind of a televisual piece, this is a kind of filmic piece, so do you have to kind of adjust your mode accordingly to that?
Weirdly, it made me more relaxed. Much of filmmaking in the BBC at the time was, one has to remember that BBC in this country grew out of radio. That many of the pioneers of television were originally radio producers. They dealt with the spoken word, and images were there as a vehicle for the spoken word, not for expressive images. And it was only in that period in the 60s that suddenly people discovered the value of cinema. So, as you say, our televisions were like this rather than that. So that kind of almost bursting out of a little image like that, with images that were expressive enough to be compared with cinema, was quite unusual. And it's as I say, I became relaxed. I think it's worth saying, because I think there is still a kind of mystique around editing that the lay person doesn't understand. For instance, in the case of Delius, we watched the rushes of the film for one whole week, about 5 hours a day, 25 hours of material for a film that was not much over an hour long. And that's what your raw material is. It's alternative shots for every scene, and it's a number of takes for each shot. So that's what you have to choose between when you're putting the film together. That doesn't mean that everything's unpredictable, but your choices are immense. You know, what shot to use when, and so on and so forth. And of course, it's about rhythms. Music being one of those rhythms. And music being an inspiration for imagery is perhaps the strongest of all, not just to Ken, but to other people too.
Sure. Yeah.
The difference being that with Ken it was integrated.
Yeah.
So much of film that we see now, music is plastered on top,
Yeah.
like the icing on a cake that's already too rich and spoils so many films.
Yeah.
It's often a case of people having not the nerve to let something speak. Whereas the best composers I've ever worked with will turn to the director and say, you don't need music here.
Yeah.
Rather than write more music, which you think composers would want to do,
Yeah.
you know, the discreet composer will say, forget it. It speaks without the music.
Yeah.
In fact, what Bresson called the delectation of music takes over.
Yes.
It interferes with the beauty of the imagery
Yeah.
and the rhythm of the imagery.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, it's well, I'm obviously on a hobby horse of mine. But the irony is that with Ken, it starts with the music.
It does. Yeah. Absolutely.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
The music takes him to imagery. And with Delius, it doesn't take him into a fantasy world. It takes him to a visual expression
Yeah.
of the precise nature of, in this case, the relationship between a composer and his amanuensis.
Just note that the film is based on Femby's memoir, Delius as I Knew Him, from 1936, which deals with the last 6 years of Delius's life when he's blind and wheelchair bound. This young man from Scarborough who hears Delius for the first time, and his life kind of changes, almost a kind of spiritual awakening, and feels he must go over to Grèce-Salon in south of Paris, where Delius is living, an artist colony, and help him.
He's almost hypnotized into that world.
I think it's a really important point as well in how Ken was perceived critically as well. I mean, he was often, his composer films, his biographical films were often sort of criticised by perhaps the more right-leaning press, more conservative press, you know, for their lack of biographical kind of authenticity, perhaps,
Or even accuracy.
Or accuracy. Yeah. What they seem to fail to recognise, what these weren't biopics or biographies in the traditional sense. These were expressionistic, impressionistic ideas of personal ideas, personal reflections. Because Ken always said that the starting point was the music and the images that were provoked by the music. And he's a musical director, not simply in the sense that, you know, he makes films about musicians or composers, or includes music, but his films themselves have a kind of musicality to them. If you take a film like Tchaikovsky, The Music Lovers, that's a symphonic film. You know, it reflects, it's in 4 acts, it has 4 major acts, it reflects kind of Tchaikovsky's own symphonic tendencies. It's the sense with Delius that the film reflects the organisation, the structure, the style of Delius's own music, perhaps.
Yeah, this is a very complex question, isn't it? I mean, don't really know where to start, because it, like a lot of these things in cinema and perhaps in art altogether, it's an accident that we have Ken Russell's film on Delius. Total accident. A certain set of circumstances contrived to produce a situation in which Ken Russell made a film on Frederick Delius. We have at least 2 treatments, if not full scripts, that were written at the BBC, for the BBC, before Ken made this film, even though Ken had it on his agenda early. But he was making a feature film. $1 Billion Brain, which was delayed in post-production, as it turned out was not as successful as obviously Ken and Harry Saltzman would have liked. In the end, Ken came back to the BBC wanting to do Delius, at a point at which another director Anthony Wilkinson had already developed a long treatment
Yeah.
based again on Fenby's book, based again on having met Fenby, based in fact on having met Max Adrian for the part of Delius. But that was all put to one side because the BBC realised that Ken should be the person to make it, under the duress of Ken saying, if you don't let me make this, I'll never work for the BBC again.
Yeah.
And that set of circumstances is quite extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's just an amazing, it's what it is.
Yeah, there's some interesting parallels there as well. This kind of Wilkinson's kind of script, this kind of rival script which is being made. Same thing happened with The Music Lovers as well. Diomkin's film on Tchaikovsky came out, I think, shortly after The Music Lovers did, and was a sort of barrier to Harry Saltzman making the film. Because he said to Saltzman that he would only do Billion Dollar Brain if he could make a musical film afterwards, and Saltzman said fine, and then Diomkin's film came out, which led him. Saltzman said, "Well, look, we can't." And
there was an Nijinsky idea in between.
Yeah, there was. So that led him to take The Music Lovers to Universal Artists. Yeah. He said the only way that he could get that film made with them was by billing it as being a film about the marriage of a homosexual to a nymphomaniac. And as he himself said, the cash registers went ka-ching. So let's move back to Delius though.
It's worth talking a bit about the Anthony Wilkinson treatment.
Tell us a bit about that.
Well, the extraordinary thing is, if you read the treatment, it seems to be the basis for what would have been a 2-hour, 2.5-hour, 3-hour film, because all the visitors to Delius in Grèce a feature in Anthony's treatment. All the people, all the well-known and not so well-known people who were encountered there. So it's a far more elaborate, even though it is basically based on that same period with Fenby and Delius working together. So almost everything's in there that Ken used. I'm not saying Ken even referred to Anthony's treatment, plus all these other, from Thomas Beecham to Balfour Gardner to Granger, of course. All that was covered in this treatment. So the refinement that Ken did is again an extraordinary aspect. Instead of taking advantage of the possibility of expanding into some of the more fantastical areas of Delius's life and work, that refinement, that distillation is amazing.
There's something quite theatrical about it, isn't there? There's bringing it down to 3 people, and the nurse and a couple of characters who come in and out. Bringing it down to kind of 3 people in this kind of fairly confined space. It's almost there's almost something of it being a play.
Yes, but a chamber work at that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But you're right about the cinematic. Just to talk about one particular section, which I remember I had a problem with, and that is the lead up to seeing the sunset. The first part of that, where they're seen carrying him on this chair with a couple of poles. The order of the shots didn't make any sense to me. No. It was shot in the Lake District, not in Norway, of course, but I assumed that Ken wanted it to be sort of down in the bottom of the valley, slowly rising up to the barren mountainside and so forth. But Ken had an entirely different concept. The ordering of the shots, because I put them together in what I thought was the logic, the visual logic, and presented it in that way, and Ken suddenly turned it on its head. Although obviously we came to the climactic shot eventually. And by that I understood, it was an example that allowed me to understand that Ken's visual imagination was so particular.
Yeah.
That what cinema allows you to do is to take an irrational form in the way you order shots, which is actually more effective than the rational form.
Yeah.
And that it's such a wonderful musical analogy, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if that as well goes back to Ken's interest in sort of European cinema and particularly kind of surrealism as well, where that idea of order is disrupted.
Yes.
And I know that there's a strong kind of sense of surrealism which goes right the way through. I mean, there's aspects of Delius which I find quite surreal as well, particularly in that kind of performance by Max Adrian. It's quite sort of quite interesting. I wondered if I could ask you about the sort of the performances in the film and how you think Delius kind of fits in with Ken's earlier work in terms of theme, ideas.
I think it was Glenda Jackson who said there was a scale of 1 to 10.
Yeah.
That in terms of how histrionic you had to be, and he was usually asking for 8. But the fact is, rightly or wrongly, casting mattered more than actually tailoring the performance during the shoot.
Yeah.
I think what Ken certainly did with Delius, where it works well, it's 9/10 the casting.
Yeah.
And in the case of Delius, the 3 people involved were very different in terms of their background.
Sure.
Max Adrian's was classical theatre. Maureen Pryor was more a method actress.
Yeah.
As we've said, Christopher Gable was a dancer. What I found very interesting was when we did the post-sync, it was all rather complicated. And we tried originally to film the post-sync with the characters involved in the scene doing their post-sync together.
Yeah.
Didn't work.
No.
Because Max, being classical, was simply giving the same performance each time, with perhaps a slight change in intonation. Maureen Pryor wanted to give a different performance given another take. Chris had never done it, and he didn't know which of these two to follow in terms of how to approach the stylization, all of which had to fit, of course, the sync of the image on the screen.
Yeah.
But they were, the casting, even though they came from different backgrounds, they were actually so ideal. I mean, the fact that Eric Fenby visited the set when the scene was being shot of the first time Fenby met Delius, and actually collapsed at the back of the set because it reminded him so vividly of his actual own experience. Yeah. There was a magic at one level between these 3 people in this film that is seldom found in filmmaking. And you don't know when you're casting, of course, how the chemistry is going to work. That the way these 3 became a little film family in front of the camera was part of what made the Delius film very special.
Yeah, and I think particularly the relationship between Jelka and Fenby is quite touching in the film.
Yes.
Particularly that moment where she takes him out and they go collecting.
He followed her into the dandelions. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. There's a bit where it's in the book as well, where he's asked to criticise one of Delius's pieces. I can't do that. She says, "I'll always tell him exactly what you think. I'll always stand by you."
Yes.
It's really interesting.
By design or coincidence or by accident, the casting of the 3 main performers in Delius is magical.
There's some really striking images in Delius, though. I think the one that particularly stands out for me is the final image where
he's laid out and
he
wheels Yelka alongside the...
That's right. It's like a Pieta.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Another kind of Catholic image.
Indeed.
Indeed. Ken once said all my films are Catholic. Again, it kind of taps back into that idea of sort of trauma and transcendence and sort of almost kind of ecstasy that kind of runs through Ken's films.
Yeah.
So I thought one of the things that really strikes me about Delius is particularly the performance of Max Adrian. It's quite a monstrous performance in some ways. He's a very empathetic, sympathetic character, but also he's a very dark character portrayed in a very sort of monstrous way. And one of the things that I always think is that Ken's composer films, his artist films, a lot of his artists, and certainly his composer films, all deal in some way with the kind of vampiric nature of fame and genius, and the way that it affects the subject, but also kind of draws from those around them as well. And I think certainly the sort of framework of Delius is very akin to Dracula, and Jonathan Harker arriving at Dracula's castle, and sort of the way that it kind of draws from him as well. And I think kind of in real life, Femby, after working with Delius, Femby kind of had a breakdown.
Absolutely, yeah.
What really strikes me about that is the way that Femby describes that moment of his life sort of changing in this transcendent way. Because it's very similar to the way that Ken sort of describes his first experience with Tchaikovsky. He'd come out of the Merchant Navy and had found himself back at his mother's house in Southampton, falling into a pit of depression and nervous breakdown. And he hears the piano concerto number 1 in B flat minor, B flat minor, and suddenly he has this kind of moment of transcendent awakening and rushes down, and he describes buying the vinyl and coming home and putting it on, in the same way that Femby describes hearing Delius for the first time on the radio and rushing out and buying the record. So I think in the film there's a kind of identification. Ken sort of identifying with Femby, because the film is about Femby rather than Delius, I think.
Sure, or it's Delius from Femby's perspective, yeah. I'm going along your line of vampires now and thinking, in a way, Ken discovered many varieties of vampires.
Oh, absolutely.
That in fact, the personalities, the characters, and what, indeed, not just composers, but mostly composers presented to Ken in terms of their music and their lives, had a great variety to them. Debussy is not the same as Elgar.
No.
Bartók is very different from Mahler. I mean, you know, there's a wonderful variety, but you could call them the varieties of vampiric nature.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a strange way.
And of course, you know, in the late 1970s, you know, he tried to tackle the most famous vampire of all by writing a Dracula script. In some ways you could say that maybe he'd already made a Dracula film with Delius. There was a very sort of roundabout way. But in that film, the vampire Dracula, he's a sort of artistic vampire. He kind of feeds on the genius of kind of composers like Beethoven and Brahms, and then different sort of cultural moments. But that film again was sort of kicked to the touchlines by a rival film, the John Badham, a film with Frank Langella. There's a thread running throughout Ken's work, a kind of preoccupation with the Gothic, particularly with Poe, Stoker and Shelley, and certainly kind of there's a lot of the Gothic in Delius.
And if you think about it, there are other composers who it's surprising that he didn't tackle. I mean, my own favourite would have been Berlioz.
Well, he was going to do it.
Yeah.
He had Murray Melvin in his sights to play. But I talked to Murray about this, and it would have been fantastic. It was all based upon the
Symphony Fantastique.
Symphony Fantastique, yeah, so it would have been a kind of
it's there, the score's there already.
Yeah, exactly.
in 4 movements. The Witch's Sabbath even.
Yeah. You wrote a chapter for the recent edited collection, The Films of Ken Russell, which was published by Edinburgh University Press in early 2023. And that's called The Virtue of Restraint, your chapter. And it's kind of a personal reflection on your experience working with Delius. Why was it called that? What led you to that title?
Well, I think we've kind of alluded to it already. When I spent the week watching the rushes for Delius, my first feeling was disappointment. Mm-hmm. I thought, so I'm the one who gets the dud. Mm-hmm. But that was based, of course, on having seen Ken's work certainly from Bartók onwards, which became more and more extravagant, more and more fantastical. And here was something which seemed to contain nothing of that. And if you can imagine the fact that all the composing scenes were shot on 3 cameras, so actually a whole day was spent watching the rushes of just that from different camera points of view. Yeah. And seen like that, it became very boring. And I'm thinking, how do I bring life into this material? Yeah. Which seems on the face of it to be repetitive, in a sense very ordinary, very run-of-the-mill, very, and what I didn't perceive because of my preconception was that this was a material for a very intense, closely observed relationship between a composer and his amanuensis with the long-suffering wife as well. Which was clearly, as it turned out, one can see in retrospect, the ingredients for a very, very special film. Yeah. But it's, raw material can always seem very deceiving in terms of what it can produce.
Well, it cleaves very closely as well, doesn't it, to Femby's source material?
Indeed.
More so than later on he made the music lovers based on the book Beloved Friend, the letters between Tchaikovsky and Madame von Meck, his patroness. But this is much more focused, because the book itself is very focused.
Yes.
It's very kind of what A to B to C to D,
but the way it integrates, in a sense, detail of the life with Delius at Grèce and the composing scenes is a wonderful combination. Yeah, the way it works out as part of the fabric of the film. Yeah,
I think that the sequence that really kind of stands out for me, anyway, in the film is the sequence with Percy Granger, because it really suddenly the film lifts. Then and it becomes light and it becomes airy, and it gives you that sort of pause. It gives you that break in the film, just to kind of almost take in the air a little bit,
Yes.
As you go out into nature, and the film. It's a film which is really preoccupied with the natural world, with woodland, with water, particularly.
Yes.
Like as Delius's music was as well. It's another example of sort of the image. We talked earlier about the sort of the conjunction of image and sound. It's very present in Delius, particularly in those scenes of the natural world of nature.
Yes. Remembering, of course, that as we hear when Femby rereads the letter from Jelka, when he's arrived, but he's rereading the letter that in a sense signalled his departure from Yorkshire. Arrival in France, Jelka says, "We live very simply here," and mentions the fact that the house is by the river, which we never see in the film.
No, that's right. Yeah.
Because there was no river by the side of the house in Surrey where they shot the exteriors. It's a strange conjuncture. But that sense, and I think the other thing we were talking about is that Grèce was a centre of artists for that, enjoying that period, and wasn't far from where Renoir shot that lovely short film in Partie de Campagne, which is a film that Renoir never completed, but was completed after the war by his editor, and became a classic.
Yeah.
But uses, in that case, the river very strongly. And yet, of course, we do have water scenes in the Delius film. Yeah. Obviously shot in other places.
Yeah, it was all shot around sort of Bordeaux and the Lake District and Keswick.
Yeah.
Places like that, the outside sequences. But I think kind of it's a film which is deeply steeped in a sense of romanticism.
Yes.
As well, particularly the idea of genius and sort of romantic genius as being kind of vampiric, as we kind of said, but also the idea
of having at least a darker side.
Yes, exactly. But also the sublime. It starts a bit like Elgar, actually, a young man on the hills. Just as Elgar starts with that beautiful shot of the young Elgar on a horse. Yes. Starts with Femby and on the hills in Yorkshire.
I don't know whether the moment that scene comes alive for me is not with the sheep, not with his notebook, but bending down by the waterside and using a tuning fork against the rock by the water to listen.
Yeah, that's right.
And listening becomes is the kind of the calling card of Ken's films. They ask you to listen as well as to watch. Yeah. And that's the way music and because it's so ironical that his starting point is music, but the strength of his films is visual.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, for him, there, as we said, they kind of you can't disconnect them. No. The visual from the imagistic from music. In your chapter on Delius, you talk in detail about the missing Laurel and Hardy sequence at the beginning of the film. I wonder if you could put that in some context for us.
If people have seen it, it makes more sense because of Fenby, Christopher as Fenby, reference to accompanying Laurel and Hardy films when he first meets Delius, was the fact that Ken uses a sequence from a Laurel and Hardy film to open the film, which couldn't be used for the DVD because the rights to Laurel and Hardy couldn't be cleared. But even here, Ken's creativity is seen because he chooses a film Way Out West, which was actually a sound film. Yes. Was actually made after sound came in. Yeah, it did. But he treats it as a silent film so that he can use it for Fenby playing the organ whilst we're seeing these wonderful images of the pair dancing in front of a Wild West saloon.
That's right, yeah.
I remember putting that all together because that sequence, that scene, that starting the film, harks back to the way Ken had to make films in the early days of the BBC, where you couldn't get everything shot and you had to resort to library material. Yeah. So we had library material of an audience, we had the images from the Laurel and Hardy film and shots of Christopher Fenby actually playing the organ to playback. Yeah. So, and you combine all these, and through the magic of editing, and Ken being able to conceive it together, this integrates into something that appears like, a moment in the history of Fenby, which is in stark contrast to the world he enters on going to France and meeting Delius, who is clearly not amused by Fenby saying, I now accompany silent films, mostly Laurel and Hardy's. and Delia saying, Laurel and Hardy?
Well, you make a really interesting point in the chapter where you say that it's a bit misleading to, in the film, in the sense that kind of, as it's presented, Fenby doesn't have much musical experience prior to Delius, where in fact he did. He was a church organist.
He was, indeed.
But I think it's maybe another example of Ken sort of refitting Themby's experience to match his own, in the sense that we talked about that kind of experience with Tchaikovsky. Prior to that, uh, his experience was really going to the cinema,
Yeah.
being taken to the cinema with his mother,
Yeah.
and hearing the music of the sound on the film, and
Yeah.
the accompaniment of the organist to the music. So again, there you've got Ken embedding his own experience
Sure.
within that. So you worked on these really sort of groundbreaking films that Ken made in the sort of mid to late 1960s. Um, what do you think his legacy is in terms of filmmaking, in terms of the sort of biographical format? Is it still felt?
I think for there to be a living legacy, we'd have to have produced filmmakers of a similar imagination. I think we have had filmmakers since then of certainly as much imagination. I'm thinking of a Terence Davies, for instance, and other similar examples, but no one with precisely the approach that Ken had, and certainly no one with that deep an interest in, well, broadly classical music and the composers that go with it. I don't want to be negative, but I'm afraid for me, much of cinema, as well as television, film, or streamers, music is very badly used.
Yeah.
It's overused, and often is unnecessarily used.
Yeah.
I remember watching a TV series recently, which I won't name, where there was only one theme, and it was iterated in different forms throughout, 10 parts of a series, showing a total lack of imagination, taking no lesson from what Ken did. It's more. I mean, clearly there is the residual of what Ken did to make people aware of classical music, and indeed both listening to and going to concerts of.
Yeah. I mean, he certainly popularised the composers after the films came out, whether it be Mahler or Tchaikovsky or Delius. But what impacts do you think these films have had sort of going forward? Or do you think, as perhaps it might be the case, that in some ways this kind of great body of work has been incredibly and unfairly neglected in terms of its lasting legacy? I mean, this is one of the things that I think kind of is important to take into account, is the way that Ken was treated going forward, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, when he was increasingly seen as being at odds with the British film establishment, something of a pariah. In the early 70s, he was given these sort of media titles, the madman of British cinema and the enfant terrible of British cinema, which kind of followed him around, and I think in a rather negative way, in a sort of pejorative way, and which he found he had to kind of live up to towards the end of his career. But it obscures particularly the early work, these kind of symphonic pieces, these beautiful musical.
But I think we have to remember that this has happened to most great filmmakers.
Yeah.
That they become unfashionable, forgotten even, but they come back. And he's certainly been in and out of fashion a couple of times since his death. But there are so many examples that are similar. So I'm sure Ken's work, as long as it's available to be seen, will awaken an interest in future generations, because it is that good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're at a point now where with various releases of Ken's work that the BFI particularly are putting out on Blu-ray. So the Music Lovers is coming out finally, and sort of Blu-ray. There's kind of screenings of his work. He's gradually becoming, and I know a lot of PhD students who are writing about Ken. So he's gradually being picked up again by a new audience, I think. So maybe his time's coming back round again. We can only hope.
I hope so.
So, just to conclude, thanks so much, Roger, for coming. It's been a really fascinating conversation. It's been great to talk to you about your work with Ken and work in the BBC, and hear all about the way that the arts was treated and sort of arts programming worked in the BBC in the 1960s, particularly this really important moment in broadcasting, transitional moment in broadcasting, and of course about Delius as well. It's a fascinating film, which I think everyone should see. I think for me, it's among my favourite, if not my favourite.
I was just very lucky to work on it. You know, it was an accident of time and place, which was the highlight of my editing career.
Yeah. Fantastic. I mean, we should say as well that you went on to work with Ken Clarke on Civilization.
True.
As well, which again must have been a mammoth task.
Sure.
Yeah, another really important moment in BBC broadcasting. So I thought we could sort of just conclude by thinking about what happened to arts programming at the end of the 1960s, because it began to dissipate, didn't it?
Yes, I mean, I partly due to the fact that the expansion to cope with a second channel and the transfer to colour had reached its zenith, and there was an infrastructure sufficient to cope with feeding two channels. But also there was a change in leadership at the top of the BBC's Music and Arts, which I think struggled to maintain the openness and the courage to support new filmmakers, not just Ken, but a number of others who were certainly as interesting in different ways. And all good things come to an end. It was, thank goodness, we had that decade.
Yeah, I mean, and for Ken as well, it ended on an interesting note, didn't it, with his next film,
Indeed.
For Omnibus, because Deus was made for Omnibus, which kind of succeeded Monitor. But Dance of the Seven Veils, his film about Richard Strauss, his was a comic strip in 7 acts.
Indeed.
Or his comic strip, as he called it, for...
Script on a couple of postcards.
Yeah. Which, of course, kind of was his first major controversy.
Indeed.
Got banned for 50 years. The Strauss family.
So in a way, he left on a high.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's incredibly experimental. I think by that point he'd sort of gone about as far as he could go in terms of TV, and of course what was coming up next for him was The Music Lovers.
The big screen beckoned.
Women in Love, which the Music Lovers, and of course then The Devils, and that was it. He was into his kind of great golden period in the 1970s, becoming one of the most important, if not the most important, British director of art cinema.
Absolutely.
Of course, he did go back to television as well in the sort of the early 90s, but for the other team, right?
Indeed.
For Melvyn Bragg at the South Bank show on ITV.
Melvyn having been a colleague of his at
Absolutely,
the BBC.
Yeah, he collaborated with.
Indeed, wrote the Debussy
film, The Music Lovers as well.
Yeah.
And he created some really interesting films for ITV. He went back to compare, because he'd had this period in the sort of the 80s where he'd sort of gone off into genre filmmaking. He'd made horror films like Gothic and Lair of the White Worm and Altered States. So he was catering to a new audience as well, particularly a VHS audience, which VHS obviously kind of taking off at the time. So the ITV work season returned to composer filmmaking, films like The Strange Affliction of Anton Bruckner or Vaughan Williams.
But psychologically, it seems to suggest that there was a part of him that missed the kind of freedom, even though it was restricted, that he'd had in those in the 60s.
Oh, absolutely. And I think there's an arc with Ken's work as it goes, as it comes to its kind of the end of its second half, if you like. It starts to go back on itself. So he goes back to composer filmmaking, and then he returns to amateur filmmaking. He ends up where he starts.
Yeah.
Because he couldn't get anyone to fund his work, so he just thought, I'll fund it myself.
Yeah.
And I'll do it myself. And it's brilliant in that respect.
Yeah.
So, thank you again, Roger. That's been fantastic.
A pleasure.
Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.